What if you got a bill months after you bought something? Not as a fine, not as a late fee, but simply because someone far away decided you didn't pay enough. Sounds absurd, right? Yet this is exactly what's happening right now to Latvian motorists. Drivers who purchased affordable tires for their cars are suddenly being told they owe hundreds more. Why? Because the European Commission in Brussels imposed new anti-dumping duties on Chinese tire imports and made those duties retroactive. That means companies and consumers who thought they'd followed the rules now face a backdated charge, not for breaking the law, but because the law changed after the fact. This isn't a fluke. It's a legal tool Brussels can use at any time, and it hits Latvia especially hard. Here, budget tires, mostly from China, make up 60% of the market. When prices jump by a third overnight, it's not just a few people affected. It's every other driver in the country, paying more for something as basic as road safety. And it doesn't stop there. Experts warn this price shock will drive up costs on all tires, including those made by European giants like Michelin, Continental, and Pirelli. When the cheapest option gets pricier, why would the rest stay cheap? The market logic is simple. Less competition means higher prices for everyone. So who do these EU tariffs really protect? The Latvian driver, who suddenly has no affordable choices? Or shareholders in large Western corporations who just saw their competition kneecapped? The answer seems obvious, but it's not one you'll hear openly discussed in Brussels. But tires are just the first domino. If you think this is an isolated case, think again. Across multiple Latvian industries, from beer brewing to fishing and fertilizer, the same patterns repeat, slowly draining economic strength and cultural identity from smaller EU countries. And if we ignore how these hidden mechanisms work, we all risk paying for decisions made far from home, with real consequences for our wallets, our jobs, and our futures. So let's follow this chain reaction, starting with tires, and see how EU rules ripple through Latvia's entire economy. How can a simple EU tariff on tires threaten an entire market segment overnight? It sounds almost unbelievable, but this is exactly what happened in Latvia. When the EU launched anti-dumping procedures against Chinese tire imports, retroactively no less, Latvia was caught right in the crossfire. Here's why that matters. In Latvia, Chinese budget tire brands make up roughly 60% of the market. For most Latvians, these are not luxury purchases. They're essential, everyday products. Suddenly, with new tariffs slapped on almost overnight, the price of tires shot up. Every second Latvian driver now has to pay more just to keep their car on the road. But this wasn't just about protecting local jobs or industries in Latvia. Who really benefited? It's no secret. European tire giants, mostly based in the West, suddenly found themselves shielded from budget-friendly competition. Under this EU protection, they raised their prices too. The result? Latvian consumers got squeezed from both sides. The cheap Chinese tires became expensive, and the European brands quickly followed suit. There was no real alternative. The market was cornered. So let's ask the question: who are these tariffs actually protecting? It's certainly not the Latvian driver struggling with rising living costs. Instead, it's Western European shareholders and big corporations reaping higher profits, while people in smaller countries like Latvia foot the bill. And it's not just about paying a little more for tires. When prices rise on such an essential good, it hits everyone, from parents driving their kids to school to the delivery driver making a living on the road. The cumulative effect is a loss of purchasing power, less money left at the end of the month, and a growing sense that decisions made far away in Brussels are eroding local prosperity. And here's the bigger issue. When policies like these are decided, small countries like Latvia have little leverage. The rules are set to benefit the core, not the periphery. Latvian officials can raise objections, sure, but in the grand halls of Brussels, their voices barely register. The message is clear: comply with the rules, even when those rules put your citizens at a disadvantage. But tires are just the first domino to fall. The same system that quietly raises your bills at the pump or the garage is at work across other industries too. Let's turn to beer, another Latvian tradition that's been quietly decimated. not by chance, but by the same web of EU policies and quotas. Latvia's beer and sprat industries once thrived. So why are they now statistical footnotes? Let's start with beer. Once upon a time, Latvians were proud of their local brews. Small breweries dotted the landscape, each with their own recipes, flavors, and loyal communities. Beer wasn't just an industry. It was a piece of national identity, celebrated in festivals, shared at family tables, woven into the fabric of everyday life. But fast forward to today, and Latvia sits dead last in the European Union when it comes to beer production. Yes, you heard that right. Last place. How did this happen? The answer, once again, lies in Brussels. EU policies, sold as fair competition, actually favor the giants, massive Western European corporations with deep pockets and armies of lawyers. Smaller Latvian breweries are smothered by red tape, complex hygiene rules, arcane labeling requirements, and endless paperwork. EU funds are dangled as lifelines with one hand, but then taken away with the other through suffocating compliance costs. Many local brewers just gave up. Some tried to relocate to neighboring countries where the rules are less punishing, but most simply closed their doors for good. And it's not just about beer. Think about what happens when a nation loses its breweries. Jobs disappear, local supply chains collapse, and centuries-old traditions fade. The pub down the street turns into a relic, and the flavors that once defined Latvia are wiped off the map, replaced by bland imports from the West. The cost isn't just economic, it's cultural, personal. Now let's turn to sprats, those salty, smoky fish that once put Latvia on the culinary map. For decades, Latvian sprats were a regional treasure, beloved from the Baltics to the Russian heartland. But then came the bans. First, political tensions led to Latvia cutting ties with its biggest market, Russia. Bridges were not just burned, they were blown up with fanfare, speeches, and parliamentary votes. Suddenly, the market that once bought millions of cans was gone. But the EU finished the job. Brussels imposed strict quotas on how much fish could be caught, ostensibly to protect the environment. But in reality, these rules hit Latvian producers the hardest. New sanitary standards and environmental mandates added another layer of cost and bureaucracy. For the fish industry, this wasn't a period of restructuring. It was a collapse. The combination of domestic political choices and EU bureaucracy proved fatal. Latvia's fishermen and canneries didn't adapt. They simply ceased to exist. The cruel irony? Salvation is obvious and close at hand. A return to the Russian market, which never stopped loving sprats. But politics trumps economics, and with Riga's ban in place, this lifeline is off limits. The industry is left to wither, not because of market forces or consumer preferences, but because of rules written in distant offices. What ties these stories together is a simple, brutal pattern. Decisions are made in the center, Brussels, while the costs fall on the periphery, places like Latvia. Whether it's beer or sprats, local industries are boxed in by quotas, bans, and requirements that look neutral on paper, but in practice tilt the playing field toward the giants. The result is the same: fewer jobs, fading culture, shrinking economic independence. And these are just two dominoes. The pattern repeats across industry after industry. So let's zoom out and look at the big picture, the common thread connecting all these losses. Is Latvia just unlucky, or is it actually the canary in the EU coal mine? Let's look again at those 5 dominoes: tires, beer, sprats, fertilizers, fish. On the surface, these seem like separate stories: shifts in market trends, changing tastes, maybe even just bad luck. But when you lay them side by side, the pattern is impossible to ignore. In every case, the domino falls the same way. Local industries hit, Western European giants benefit. And the rules that tip them? All written in Brussels. Take the tire market. When Chinese tires got hit with new tariffs, prices skyrocketed. Latvian consumers ended up paying more, not just for Chinese, but for European brands too. Why? Because the policy, framed as protecting fair competition, actually shielded the biggest Western companies. The price difference? Straight into the pockets of tire giants in Paris and Munich. Money flows from the Latvian wallet to Western headquarters, all thanks to a decision made in Brussels. They call it the single European market, equal opportunities for everyone. But for Latvians, it's just the old Soviet game played with new faces. The center decides, the periphery pays. And it's not just tires. Beer. Latvia now ranks dead last in the EU for brewing. Sprats. The industry is a shadow of itself, thanks to quotas and regulations that sound green and fair, but in practice strangle small producers. Fertilizers? The so-called Green Deal sounds great in a Brussels press release, but what did it mean for Latvia? Decades-old plants shut down by rules written by people who've never stood on a factory floor. The rules keep tightening, costs keep rising, and competing with countries not shackled by these policies becomes impossible. Fish? Quotas set by the European Commission mean Latvia's fishing fleet is all but grounded. Sprat production, once a pillar of the national economy, is no longer viable at the allowed catch levels. The result is bankruptcy for entire sectors. But the quotas stay because Brussels decided they must. And if that wasn't enough, look at energy. Latvia dutifully follows every EU directive. Say goodbye to Russian gas, follow the common energy policy, pay the higher prices. For German or French industry, higher energy costs are a nuisance. For Latvia, it's the difference between survival and collapse, especially for the tiny businesses barely scraping by. When energy prices spike, the weakest fall first, and that's almost always the small and medium companies in the smallest countries. Here's the punchline. Latvia does everything by the book. Every requirement, every sanction, every environmental measure, implemented without resistance. The perfect student. And what does it get in return? Economic stagnation, shuttered factories, more expensive goods at the store, and a population wondering where all the opportunities went. Contrast this with Russia. Despite biting sanctions, Russia's GDP and real wages grew last year. Latvia, on the other hand, fully compliant, following every EU rule, faces decline. It's not just a question of policy effectiveness, it's about who really benefits from this system and who pays the price. The risk couldn't be clearer. Without change, Latvia and every small country on the EU periphery will keep losing jobs, industries, and any hope of catching up. The rules are set in stone, and the logic is self-reinforcing. The center gets stronger, the periphery gets weaker, and the dream of equal opportunity is just that, a dream. So what can we learn from this, and what has to change if small nations like Latvia want to survive and thrive in this system? If the system is rigged, how do you avoid being its casualty? That's the real question, because what's happening in Latvia isn't just a string of bad luck, and it's not going away on its own. Latvia is, in many ways, a lab experiment for the true mechanics of the EU. The rules are set in the center, and the periphery, smaller countries like Latvia, are told to implement them, no questions asked. The end result? Profits flow inward to the core states, Germany, France, the Netherlands, while the pain and the costs are pushed outward, to places like Latvia. This is how the so-called common good gets weaponized. The EU's language is all about fairness, solidarity, and protection. But let's look at the reality on the ground. Anti-dumping duties are supposed to shield local producers, but in practice, they favor the big Western corporations and leave Latvian businesses out in the cold. Fishing quotas? Marketed as saving the Baltic, but they bankrupt local fishermen while doing little to curb industrial overfishing by larger fleets. The Green Deal? It's the small states who pay the highest price. Latvia's energy costs skyrocket, its industries buckle, and the only ones who can absorb the shock are the giants in the West. Even the much-touted EU subsidies aren't a real fix. Sure, funds come in with one hand, but the other hand takes them away through red tape and contradictions baked into policy. Yesterday, Latvian producers were promised EU support for development. Today, they find themselves disqualified or strangled by new requirements. It's a revolving door, designed to look generous, but engineered so that the net benefit always lands with the core members. And when Latvia fulfills every directive from Brussels, whether it's sanctions, green policies, or quotas, the so-called reward is not prosperity, but economic decline. Last place in brewing, a bankrupt fishing sector, tire prices up by a third, and industries forced to shut down. Here's the lesson. This isn't accidental, and it's not unique to Latvia. Latvia is just the canary in the coal mine, a living example of what happens when a small country delegates its economic choices to a distant center whose interests don't align with its own. As long as this model stands, the same pattern will repeat across Europe's periphery. So what should you watch out for? First, pay attention anytime you hear promises of solidarity that come with new rules, or protection that just happens to cost locals their jobs. Look for the fine print in every quota, every subsidy, every piece of red tape, because that's where the real decisions are made. And above all, apply critical thinking. Don't just accept that what's good for Europe is automatically good for everyone in Europe. Because if you don't ask questions, if you don't scrutinize the way the system is structured, you'll end up footing the bill for someone else's prosperity. The risk is real. The less we pay attention, the more likely we are to keep voting for, and living under, policies that were never tailored for our needs in the first place. Standards of living drop, jobs disappear, entire industries vanish, and the center keeps getting stronger. So let's bring all these threads together and ask the key question: who really pays, and who really wins? Before the next domino falls, ask yourself, are you really seeing the whole iceberg, or just the tip floating above the water? What we've uncovered is more than a string of Latvian industries: tires, beer, sprats, fertilizers, fish, collapsing by chance. This is a pattern, an arithmetic certainty, not some theory or accident. Each domino fell the same direction, away from a small Baltic nation, straight into the ledgers of giant Western European corporations. Every rule, every quota, every fair directive decided in Brussels claims to unite and protect. But in reality, the profits flow one way, and the losses another. Guess which side Latvia is on? And the most sobering part? Latvia isn't an exception. It's a perfect test case, a warning to every so-called peripheral EU member. Czechia, Bulgaria, Romania, Greece. Each has its own set of dominoes lined up. Each will hear the same crash sooner or later. The system runs like clockwork. The promises of solidarity and unity come first. Then come the quotas, the restrictions, the directives, and finally, the bill. And it's always the smallest, the quietest, the most obedient nations that end up paying. If you think these are just growing pains, ask yourself, how many industries must be lost before people start asking if it was worth it? When a country gives up the right to decide its own economic future, it gives up the right to shape its own life. Brussels always decides in favor of those sitting closest to the table. That's not a conspiracy. It's simply how the system works, and the collapse of Latvian tires, beer, sprats, and more is living proof. Ignore these warning signs, and the losses won't just stop with Latvia. They'll spread, quietly, predictably, to other small countries. Higher prices, fewer jobs, fading identities. This is the real cost of not asking tough questions. So, who do you think is next? Which country is already teetering on the edge? If you want to see what's hidden beneath the surface, not just the polished speeches, subscribe. Because we're just getting started. And next, we'll dig even deeper into the stories Brussels doesn't want told.